Good morning, chess fans. Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club here, continuing the series on attacking the king. Today we're looking at some very basic fundamentals with what's called the Arabian Mate. Keep in mind that chess is a couple thousand years old and really got a lot of its start back in Persia and the Arab nations and then in India. And so this is one of the earliest checkmate patterns utilizing the rook and the knight. So let's take a look at this. This is checkmate. Hopefully you can see that. This rook is causing the check, and it is protected by this knight, but the knight itself is also attacking key squares around the king, and the rook itself is covering the back rank as well. So when you look at it, covered by the knight, covered by the rook, protected by the knight, attacked by the rook, and this is referred to as the Arabian Night or Arabian Mate. And so it can also happen where the rook is on the back rank, and so let's go ahead and see that there, assuming the internet wants to work. There we go. And so you can see here that also still protected by this knight. Now the rook, of course, is giving check from the side, and the knight is still covering here, the rook is still covering this way. So whether it's checkmate here, or you move the rook down to the back rank, but most oftentimes you're going to see the Arabian mate happen where the rook is on the back rank. And so we talk a lot about getting your rooks to the back rank. Let's say your rook was down on c1, and the pawns got cleared off of the c file, and you're able to move into c7. Then this rook, of course, is patrolling the back rank and causing problems. If you get a rook down there, start looking to get your knight into position to cause an Arabian Mate. Now you might ask, well, how did this knight get there naturally? If your knight begins, we can track him backwards here, right? If your knight begins on b1, he can jump to his natural square of c3, and then he has a choice of attacking the center. And from the center, he can get to f6. And from f6, he can patrol these squares in the corner. Okay, so that's one way of looking of how can I get a knight to this square. So let's take a look at a puzzle here. This is a mate in 3. Hopefully you can see it rather quickly, noticing that we want to get the knight here, and we want to get the rook in one of these squares. So, of course, bringing the knight in is important. Once the knight is in f6, it's covering the key squares. I apologize today. I've got a dry, give me a second. Thank you for that. In this position, black only has one option to try and delay the mate, and that's simply to challenge the rook on the 7th rank. Now, the mistake that white could make here would be to try and just say check. The problem is it gives the king an escape square, and then this knight is in trouble, and it all falls apart. So white, understanding that, knowing that the rook really wants to get here, first just captures that rook. There's nothing black can do in this position, and then we have the Arabian Mate. Okay, protected by the knight, and you know all the coverage. So that's the Arabian Mate. Let's see it in a game. This is a game by Reuben Fine. Reuben Fine is a great chess author, or was a great chess author. I don't know if he's still living or not. This game was played in 1933, so probably not. I have several of his books that have been reprinted, and he's the white pieces here competing against someone with the last name of Dake. I've never heard of that player, but let's just picture it. We know that we're going to be demonstrating the Arabian Mate, which means that a knight probably wants to be here, and a rook probably wants to attack one of these two squares. And so we start to imagine, how am I going to get I mean, the knight seems obvious. It's one jump away. And for that matter, this knight is 2 jumps away. So that's really handy. How am I going to get the rooks who are behind their passed pawn down into the 7th rank to be able to come over? Or all the way down to be able to come over? Well, one thing we should notice is that the C file is completely open. There are no pawns anywhere on the C file. So we do have a pathway to victory. So it looks like we got to do some maneuvering here. One of the things you want to look for in a position like this is weaknesses. For instance, this pawn is only defended by the king, so we can easily calculate what would happen if that pawn dropped. This pawn is the only thing protecting, really, this pawn structure here. So if this pawn was to drop, suddenly these pawns can become very weak, especially this one, which is helping give coverage to the king. So looking at all of these factors here, I would say that white is definitely looking good, especially with this passed pawn with its rooks already behind it. Black's queen is out here in the center just waiting to be attacked. So go ahead and pause the video, ask yourself what would you do here, and when you come back from pausing, hopefully you considered a sacrifice. When you're looking at these positions, you look at every possible check, you look at every possible capture, and so here is a possible capture. And so capturing here, Black doesn't have to take the knight. He could just give up that free pawn and make another move, but that leaves a knight in position already, and Black does not want that. If he doesn't take the knight, well, then the next knight is coming and protecting that knight, and then he's just in there. And that's a terrible outpost for Black to give up. So the king has to take. And what we immediately notice is that this pawn is now weak, and this queen would really like to take it. Well, what we can do here is maneuver this other knight into position so that we can go for our Arabian mate. So, of course, the move is now the check, and Black probably doesn't want to sacrifice his queen for this knight, so he's going to have to move his king, and he tries to get back amongst his protection. He does have a lot of defenders around him, but he also has a lot of open holes and paths towards him. So this queen and this queen are now squared off. Now, if you're attacking, you don't want to trade off your queen because you need her as an attacking piece. So the defender would benefit here by trading queens. So white has to prevent that, and he does this by lining his rook up on this open c-file and targeting this pawn with his queen, because the rook was blocking it. It's taking a move back. The rook was blocking access for this queen to get to that pawn. So this move solves a lot of problems. Black must respond, and then in comes the check. So you can see that that sacrifice of that knight opened the position up and gave white attacking chances, and that is the purpose of a sacrifice. But you want to make sure you calculate the possibilities before you just start throwing pieces away. All right. So a simple way to get out of check here, can we capture the queen as Black? No. Can we run away as the king? Yeah, we could go here. Okay. But oftentimes the better idea is to block. And a lot of times we forget that blocking is an option. And so the beauty of this block is that it's also attacking this key piece in the position. The problem with the block is it allows this check. So now we have this rook finally on our back rank and with check, which is wonderful. Okay, it's protected by a pawn. Everything is protected here. This square is incredibly weak. We have a queen and a knight staring at it. So all the pieces are working together well. So if the king steps away, like he did in this game, then Reuben Fine found an incredible sacrifice here. Again, pause the video if you need to. The sacrifice, queen check, and in comes the knight, Arabian Mate. So hopefully you could see those moves coming. I will say that some of our more savvy audience members here playing along might ask themselves, well, why did the king run when he could have blocked? Protected by the queen. And so again, that concept of yet again blocking these checks. And one of the reasons that the block doesn't work is that because the queen can come in protected by this knight. And where is this king going to go? This is where it gets sticky. It's going to be a win. It's a little bit longer, hard-fought win. If the king comes here to h6, the queen can pick up the free bishop and with a check. And then because of this knight, the king only has one more square he can go to. So that would put this king all the way over here. And once that happens, the knight can come in and fork the rook and the king. So the end result is that this bishop falls, this rook falls. The king is on the run, and then we have threats with pawns marching up, and that king is toast. So really it was, which way does black want to lose? And since we are showing the example of how he lost in the game, we get to see this beautiful Arabian Mate. Okay, so that's the Arabian Mate. I do want to take a quick moment and just show a few quick examples of how rooks and knights can work together. The Arabian Mate technically has the king in the corner being checked by the rook, defended by the knight, with the knight covering these two squares around the corner. But that's not the only way that rooks and knights can work together. We'll just show a couple of quick diagrams. So here's an example where the knight has protection. We'll just use a basic pawn. And what we can see here is that when the rook comes in, the king only has two runaway squares. The king can step to either of these escape squares, and both of them are dead in the water. So if he moves here, checkmate. Again, defended by the knight, the rook delivers that checkmate. This time it's the rook that's in the corner, and it's kind of a corridor or edge of board style mating pattern. What if instead the king decided to move here, more out in the open? Well, we still have checkmate because this pawn is keeping the runaway square and he's blocked by his own piece. So in this instance, the rook and the knight needed some help. They needed the help from the pawn, and they needed one of the squares to be blocked by black's own piece. But you can see how the knight and the rook work together. Another example is, again, we have the support of a pawn, and in comes the knight, preparing the move of the rook for checkmate. And in this position, you can see there's no defense for black. It doesn't matter what black's move here is. All of these are blockaded. I mean, if he moves a pawn, that certainly doesn't help. These rooks have no access to here, so it doesn't even matter. Black can move, and you can see that this is checkmate. Okay, well, it's not always the rook that gives mate. What if the rook is simply covering these squares, and again we need some help from black's pieces blocking him in, and hopefully you can just see here that the knight is now delivering the check, and the rook is covering the escape squares. Okay, similar to that position, here we can see that if this queen were missing, and this rook were to come here protected by the knight, that would be enough to be checkmate. Unfortunately for white, black does have this queen protecting here. But hopefully you can see that the knight can cause checkmate from the side, and again, the rook is covering. So hopefully that gives you an idea of the Arabian Mate. A knight protecting his rook, the rook delivering checkmate in the corner. And remember, you are what you repeat. Practice these positions over the board with a friend. Watch this video again and again until it just becomes a part of your memory and you start to see these ideas in your games. Please visit us on Facebook at Hood County Chess Club. Click the like button to follow us for upcoming live events. Until next time, Zach Wilson, Hood County Chess Club.